Okay, so we're going to be looking at really the origins of the Italian Renaissance. Of course, it originated in Florence. They're going to shift into the sort of drastic, or not drastic, but dramatic change between Renaissance and Baroque architecture, form, and painting. If you remember from the Renaissance, from the early art history classes, and I mentioned this in class earlier, is that it is a rebirth of classical ideals and the reintroduction of the classical orders. Again, this will all be formatted in a PowerPoint you can read, but these are some really important Renaissance art. There were hundreds of, this was just a huge pivotal change from medieval and Gothic architecture. Now we have the period of, we're going back to neoclassical, I'm sorry, going back to early classical architecture and literature. Really, these prominent pivotal architects, Brunelleschi, we've seen Michelangelo, Raphael, we've seen tons of Palladio buildings, then we sort of barely touch on Vasari. Brunelleschi was really the originator of Renaissance architecture, particularly in Florence. So when we go back to what's called the rebirth, we have the term called beauty. As defined in this course, it's really relationships. A lot of parts in the Renaissance, there was a mathematical ratio for beauty, partially based on golden section, but of course based on early classical ideas excuse me, of architecture and proportioning back from the ancient Greeks and Romans. So we can clearly see this is some Alberti's, this is some early Renaissance work. You can see Alberti is based the facades off of definitely early classical models, of course, with particular proportioning. So last week, we just left the really dramatic, enormous work of the Gothic architecture. Remember, Gothic architecture does not have the classical orders. These are Germanic tribes that really did not borrow the classical orders for their own sort of original type of architecture. Of course, this is the architecture that can be built as tall as possible using, of course, exposed buttresses, flying buttresses. Now, remember that when you look at Renaissance architecture, there is no such thing as flying buttresses in Renaissance architecture. So let's go back to a cross section of the ancient Pantheon in Rome. We really don't see flying buttresses. Pretty much the structure is all concealed into the building's envelope. Of course, because we're building with concrete, again, if you remember, the formula for concrete was lost during the Dark or the Middle Ages. So we're building with stone and masonry. Okay, so when we go back and reintroduce classical orders, we're seeing literally that the buildings are faced with the classical orders, Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and of course, composite was introduced in the Renaissance. I'm going to show this image. This is a very telling image of the entire ideology character of the Renaissance. It's roughly the 1400s. Now, this is not the first Renaissance painting. This is a painting that Raphael, the famous artist and architect, did sort of after probably the first 50, 60 years of the Renaissance, starting from Giotto to Brunelleschi. We're looking at pretty much reintroducing all the famous Greek philosophers. The center of the composition is Plato and Aristotle. There's many different other Greek philosophers, but we're bringing back the early sort of ideas about humanity in the classical arts. So there's a question about some of the characters in the foreground. I think people think that Michelangelo is depicted here in that sort of diagonally turned stone. I think it's called Heraclitus. I can't pronounce the guy's name, but of course he's another famous philosopher. Really, this image, of course, depicts linear perspective in an architectural scene. The architectural scene here is going back to probably the ancient Roman baths, where you see the hexagonal coffers and of course the classical orders. This is a far cry more advanced than anything that we've seen in medieval or Gothic architecture, because of course, Gothic architecture has pointed arches. Roman and Renaissance architecture has pure symmetrical and spherical arches. So let's take a look at just some paintings. This is another extraordinary painting. This is Michelangelo's Rotundi painting. This is if you think about the Renaissance, we're going to be talking about Renaissance and Baroque architecture, but Renaissance paintings, of course, are what's called a high key paint color scheme, because of course, a lot of these are painted on frescoes. You really can't get a good dark sort of intensity value, definitely not black if you're painting with paints on a plaster wall or a fresco. So we look at really Renaissance paintings, most of them are done on frescoes. This is an oil painting done on a board, but the luminosity in Michelangelo's painting is absolutely unprecedented. These are just extraordinary techniques of what's called modeling. What modeling is a term that establishes the light and of course the dark side from some of the figures, the hands, and of course definitely the face. Then later we can get into the Baroque painting and architecture. Things are dark. We're using a very dark color scheme. We're using chiaroscuro, which means intensity of light and dark. You know, these chiaroscuro paintings really reflect the tension and ambiguity of the sort of Baroque era of architecture and humanities. But before we get into more detail in the Renaissance, let's kind of take a look at what happened before the medieval period. We sort of touch on the architecture, but let's take a look at medieval arts. You know, we're not seeing a lot of what's called atmospheric depth, perspective depth. We're definitely not seeing linear perspective at all. The faces are these two-dimensional flat planes. Of course, the hands are not three-dimensional. This is a very primitive way of depicting scenes and paintings. So the next slide we're going to be looking at is Giotto. He's a painter and architect really right before Brunelleschi introduced Renaissance architecture in Florence. But I'm sorry, this slide is not that clear. But what we're looking at is it's definitely a precursor to Michelangelo's really luminous work that we just saw. But of course, Michelangelo was looking at Giotto's early paintings to study the luminosity and how to properly show the proper modeling in the figures. So now we're looking at is one of the first Renaissance paintings. It's actually a mixture of Gothic and Renaissance because the Gothic artists are depicted here in the scene, but it's a Renaissance because the modeling is more three-dimensional. You know, we're definitely moved on from the two-dimensional flat images from early medieval art. So really Giotto's painting is clearly a modern painting because there's by the virtue of the fact that the three-dimensional quality is carefully painted and modeled. Then here is Giotto's architecture. He's really designed the bell tower first. Of course, it's Gothic, so we're seeing pointed arches and tracery. This is roughly 1330. You know, several years later, what happened was we're going to be looking at Brunelleschi's dome. This is just an absolutely pivotal structural type piece of architecture and just an unbelievable amount of engineering for one individual to do this. But this is Filippo Brunelleschi, his Dome of Florence in 1436. Remember this, don't ever forget it, but Renaissance architecture really began in Florence, Italy with Brunelleschi, and this is just his architecture. For somebody to figure out how to actually structurally support the span of the opening and to do the engineering is really remarkable. But before we talk about the dome, let's take a look at the cathedral itself. This is the main Basilica Cathedral of Florence. Of course, this, if you look at the top, if you can see my cursor, I'm sure you've probably seen this in your history classes, but this was an open nave. The dome was completely uncovered for about 50 years. If you see the circular windows and the unfinished entablature or the drum, where the dome sits on the drum, is that the dome wasn't existing until about for about 40 or 50 years. It was left completely open to the rain and the elements. It was only the fact that Brunelleschi won a competition to figure out how to span and cover that dome. Here's a plan of this. You know, it's an octagonal plan. We're not looking at a Roman dome until later we get into Michelangelo's Renaissance curved domes and of course the circular plan. But for the most part, this was an unprecedented engineering marvel. Now what Brunelleschi does is he's using what's called a double shell dome. You can see the two shells. One is the outer shell, one is the inner shell. Of course, the inner shell has frescoes painted. And of course, the liminal zone between the two shells is an axis. You can actually walk. If you see the little dotted lines on my cursor, you can see the spiral staircase that goes all the way to the ground that can take now, it's, of course, it's a tourist attraction to take from the ground floor all the way up to the top of the cupola. This is just an unprecedented level of imagination and structural integrity, all because the Renaissance architects, particularly Brunelleschi, would consider Gothic architectures and flying buttresses vulgar, because his argument was if you can't figure out how to structurally design a dome or large opening without buttresses, then you made some huge mistakes. But that's really their sort of philosophy on how to design large domes at this time. And of course, we're not using concrete because they really didn't reintroduced concrete in architecture until the late 1800s. So we're still building with brick masonry and stone. So we're looking at is a truly, for this time, a modern structural dome engineering marvel. We're not seeing any buttresses. We're not seeing the flying buttresses to support the walls. All the structure is completely integrated into the dome shell itself. And how did he do this? Here's just kind of a detail. It's called a herringbone pattern. So this actually helps the structure of the dome by interlocking and changing the direction of the bricks to get the maximum amount of structural capacity without having to build with buttresses. Here's a remarkable section of this enormous dome. This is the tallest, probably the largest building in a dome on Earth during this time. I think Michelangelo's dome is not quite even as tall as this one, but so not only did Brunelleschi design how to span, because a lot of people say, why didn't they just cover this octagonal opening with wooden timbers? Well, you can't possibly make wooden timbers that I think it's probably roughly 150 feet apart. Those timbers would probably deflect and break and probably perish during the inlet. So they had to use masonry and stone. And this is just, it's a remarkable amount of engineering and wooden sort of scaffolding. He made all these really interesting machines on how to bring materials up to the very top. But look how sophisticated this is to build a dome that large. I mean, this is just the imagination of one person. And he made all these wood machines, created different layers and shells and structural. He built several different models. And this is built one brick by brick after another. So let's take a look at the comparison of, I like to show architectural models versus the buildings themselves, but let's take a look at this section of the ancient Pantheon in Rome. This is just a remarkable model. Okay, so what we're looking at here is, of course, the section of the Pantheon. We're showing the dome is concrete. There's one shell, not two shells. What you're also seeing is a breakaway section. You can see how the structure of the weight of the dome is transferred down to the outer walls. Look at all the different system of arches. Those are not arches to be decorative. Those are definitely structural. And I like to just compare that because, you know, this is definitely two very severely different types of domes and structure. The Pantheon, of course, is a purely spherical, cylindrical plan and section. Of course, Brunelleschi's dome is faceted and the plan is octagonal. Okay, so that's just the Dome of Florence. Not only did Filippo Brunelleschi create this unbelievable masterpiece, he was the one that was really attributed to creating what's called the invention of linear perspective. Now, this is the baptistry that was existing while he was figuring out how to span the dome opening for the cathedral. So when he was working on the cathedral's dome, he was, sorry about that, he was looking at the baptistry across the street and was noticing that parallel lines converge to one point. So in observing this, this is a huge exhibit for the citizens and townspeople in Florence. He made a little diagram. I'm not really sure I can explain this without having a physical demonstration, but he was able to put a mirror and a piece of glass and prove to people that this is how linear perspective works. And they were absolutely amazed. This revolutionized painting, three-dimensional qualities, perception. So now if you go back up to the difference between this and this, wow, look how three-dimensional and spatial all the paintings can be at this time. So of course, this is Raphael about 100 years later after Brunelleschi, but he's incorporating all the ideas that Brunelleschi taught him. It's a mixture of Renaissance architecture and of course the ancient classical ideas of philosopher. This is definitely just, this person was just unbelievable in architecture, painting, and just changing your mindset of how things are perceived. Those are just a few of his buildings. Here's some other, if you look at his, this is, I think, San Lorenzo in Florence, you can see an incredible plan of columns. The structure of it is just remarkable. Of course, you're seeing an imagination. You can see somebody that really was devout to learning perspective, because the nave is a perspective quarter. You have to be able to draw perspective to really create and design something like this. And of course, here is Brunelleschi's incredible Corinthian capitals, but look how thin the columns are, and the arches and the dome above that are huge structures. I'm not exactly sure what kind of stone this is, but the stone is very gray and completely homogeneous. It makes the clarity of the space really read very simply. Now, obviously, that ceiling is a wooden truss decorated with plaster and probably paintings. There is a dome at the end of that. I like to show the outside of Brunelleschi's buildings. They're not faced with marble and other shiny materials, of course, like we see in classical ancient Rome. Now, we did look at, we're going to shift over to Michelangelo's dome. It's not quite as tall, but it is still an unbelievable structural marvel. I don't think it's quite as tall as the Brunelleschi dome in Florence, but it is still remarkable. Michelangelo is designing 3 shells, not 2. We see the inner shell, which is proportioned for the interior of the nave and the space. The 2 shells are scaled for the size of the dome, of course, in the Vatican. So we're looking at 3 different shells, and you can, of course, it's really wonderful to be able to walk through the 2 shells, and what starts as a staircase turns into a ladder. You can actually occupy the entire cupola out there. But what's different about Michelangelo's dome and Brunelleschi's dome is we're really not supposed to see buttresses, but of course, the weight and the size of this dome lends itself because Michelangelo had to add extra support for the columns. So the pair of columns, he's actually disguising the fact that he actually did have to use what's called buttresses. They're not flying buttresses, but they're engaged masonry piers to bear the weight of the dome onto, of course, the drum, the cylindrical part underneath the dome. So we don't see the buttresses on Brunelleschi's dome, which was probably a little bit more sophisticated than Michelangelo, but still they're just both unbelievable. And Michelangelo was 90 years old when he did St. Peter's. This is before they had health insurance, and they ate real food and drank watered down wine, and he lived and breathed architecture. But for somebody to do this in their 90s is just unbelievable. Here is a large axonometric of, of course, the entire building was not designed by Michelangelo. Moderno, later during the Mannerists of the Baroque era, added the large facade. They extended the nave. We're seeing the Diocletian window from the ancient Bastion Diocletian, which I was surprised to see that as the lunette above the principal nave. Of course, then here's Michelangelo's dome, of course, with the lanterns that illuminate the side aisles. Here's an absolutely magnificent painting of this is really what the sanctuary looks like. Of course, I'm not sure there's quite that many cherubs, in the painting, but this is just phenomenal spatial experiences. And ultimately, when the nave was extended from the dome, it ruined the view of the dome from the piazza. So the best parts, the views of the dome are really from behind the Vatican gardens. And of course, this is really special. I love this image, the keyhole. This is the Maltese keyhole at Piazza Cavalieri. It's one of Rome's tallest hill, but you can see the beautiful poetic dome framed by the vignette of the trees, and of course the keyhole and a large gate. It is really wonderful. It's a completely unexpected surprise to climb the hill and look through the hill and see that magnificent dome. Really wonderful. Okay, so we're going to move on to some other architects. I think I've sort of briefly, we've seen Andrea Palladio's Renaissance architect of the 1560s. He's remarkable. I'd want to show you something we probably haven't really touched on for a while, but we're going to be looking at Vasari. Giorgio Vasari was an unbelievable writer. If you watched or listened to my lecture several months ago about the literature of classical architecture, was that Vasari was really the father of modern art. He wrote, of course, the lives of the painters, architects, and writers of the Renaissance, and there are hundreds of chapters on all the phenomenal. He pretty much walked around Florence and Rome and praised all the Renaissance art because this was such an extraordinary time for architecture, building, and painting. And so here is what I'm considering a very modern quarter. It connects the Arno River to Palazzo Vecchio. Of course, it's the medieval tower, and it is medieval because we're not seeing the classical orders, we're seeing exposed bricks, we're seeing architecture, and it's really bare bones. Of course, Vasari's facades are remarkably beautiful. Not only the fact that they're using the classical orders, but they're very carefully proportioned based on ancient classical ideas about proportioning from classical architecture. Here's a plan, but look how, if you look at the plan of Florence, the streets are very haphazardly arranged. There's not a Cartesian grid. It's a very sort of haphazard medieval plan. There's really nothing orthogonal. So he adds this really modern corridor. These are the government offices for the city of Florence roughly in the 1500s. And what's modern about it is because, of course, the loggia is completely occupied by pedestrians. You can be completely covered by all the buildings. And what's really remarkable is that it frames the view from the Honor River facade down, of course, to the street where Palazzo Vecchio, the main city hall in Florence, he was and still probably is. But these facades are just absolutely exquisite. It's interesting what Vasari does with the load-bearing piers. He cuts niches in them for dignitaries and sculptures. It's a very elegant building. Of course, the entire top quarter is now an art gallery. There are thousands of remarkable Florentine. There's several Botticellis. It's really extraordinary to even go up there and visit. And also what he did was he created a private corridor for several dignitaries connecting the Pitti Palace back to, of course, Palazzo Vecchio. So this corridor is really a private corridor. And it's just really, it's interesting what Vasari does with arches, because there's arches within arches in the actual facade. So we're just going to briefly touch on, Renaissance. I mean, the Renaissance wasn't just in Italy. There were some Renaissance buildings, some in Germany. A lot of them were in French. We're going to be looking at French Renaissance in France. We're still kind of mixing the Gothic tracer, the medieval window. A medieval window is that 2/2 light pattern with this stone crossbars in between that. What's interesting is, we still sort of see crenellations, ribbed vaulting. It's not truly Renaissance because we're still using Gothic sensibilities, but it is really extraordinary. I think this is one of the chateaus out in the Loire Valley, but we can see the entire landscape of chimneys and crenellations. But let's take a look at the Fontainebleau, the School for Art and Architecture. The original buildings, of course, were medieval because we're not seeing Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian on the facades. Later, the additions, of course, are clearly Renaissance. And what's interesting, we see an enormously Baroque staircase, but the staircase eclipses pretty much the tiny little front door. The staircase is proportioned for the entire building, not just for the entry. But the Renaissance facades are just as beautifully and carefully proportioned as you would see any sort of Renaissance building in Italy or Florence. So last week we looked at ancient Rome, roughly between 1st century and 400 AD. So now we're looking at what's called modern Rome. We're looking at a mixture of 1st century AD fragments, and of course Renaissance and Baroque domes. These are, of course, all the domes here are all stone, not concrete. We're still not building with concrete at all whatsoever. I'm going to just kind of take a 2-minute break. We'll come back and talk about Baroque architecture and geometry. I just need to catch my breath. It's already 12:30. I want to make sure we have enough time for Baroque. So. Okay, so now we're in Baroque architecture and geometry. We've seen these before in class, but it's interesting to kind of revisit these. And I've given, hundreds of lectures, and it's kind of good to go back. I just like to compare the radical change from classical Renaissance architecture and, of course, Baroque geometry. So let's take a look at, this is the plan of the Cathedral of Florence um, by Brunelleschi. This is technically a medieval and Gothic floor plan. Let's take a look at really two prominent Baroque architects in the Baroque era. This is, of course, in Rome, San Carlo and Saint Ivo, both designed by Morabini. There's a lot of spiritual meaning in the complex geometry. We have ellipses now. We're not really building with pure circles, but the part on the right is you can see that the system of triangles is the perfect sort of geometric relationship for a church. We have the triad, the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, but these are really interesting little complex geometric puzzles. Not only is it really just remarkable to imagine these things, you have to draw them and then build them. I'm just kind of going to revisit some of these for a minute. But the left, of course, is the floor plan of the small, these are really relatively small chapels. What I'd like to mention is let's take a look at these two plans and remember that. And let's go back to, let's see, St. Peter's by Michelangelo. The scale of that, if you remember the images I just showed you, the plan of those buildings is roughly the size of one of these little domes, these little spherical projections on the roof. Those are tiny chapels compared to the scale and magnitude of St. Peter's. And that's just mind-boggling to think that these are small little jewelry boxes and they're absolutely just exquisite. So, we're definitely, it's kind of like classical Renaissance architecture on acid. The walls are undulating, they're warped. The classical orders, the entablature have all these really wonderfully undulating curves. It's remarkable to think that these were actually constructed. They didn't, of course, have computer technology. They had, tools and compasses, and they knew how to properly construct all of these very complex shapes. Now, this is the facade of San Carlo. Of course, it's the intersection of the four fountains, but the facade is really the main central part, which of course encompasses the main facade of the church. It's kind of like, what I mentioned about Gothic architecture earlier is like the heavy metal music of architecture. Once you walk in there, it is completely transcended. I mean, it takes you into another world. When I walk these in person, it looks like I'm going to heaven. I'm walking through these extraordinary clouds. They're all painted white, and it's just extraordinary to think that the imagination and creation in Baroque architecture has capabilities. Sorry, can you still see the full screen?
Yes, we can see the full screen.
Okay. So, what we're seeing is classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, but a very warped language. Borromini kind of warps the Corinthian capitals. These are not the best images of the Corinthian capitals. You can tell they're definitely different, exaggerated variations on the classical orders. Here's a plan. What's interesting is that you can see that it looks like a very chaotic plan of curves and ellipses, but there is a very careful order. The foci points, or the system of the centering for each one of the chapels or the side aisles, is a very special relationship in the mixture of where they intersect the radial points, of course, for the ellipse to construct the main sanctuary. But these churches have what a wonderful French term called poché. It means carved out of a solid mass. It looks like somebody took a huge block of plaster and stone and just carved out and subtracted all of the spaces out. When I teach architecture, even in modern architecture, I try to incorporate the use of poché in their plans because everything they draw is with one line. It's very hard for them to get them to draw some intensity in the wall thickness. If you look close, you can see the circulation. The stairs are very carefully concealed inside the poché between each one of the spaces. Here's a wonderful cross section. Yeah, there you go. You can probably see Borromini's sort of playful Corinthian order. You can see there's definitely festoons or garlands in between each one of these exaggerated Ionic volutes. It's a better picture. Yeah, these are better pictures. Yeah, I mean, look at that. The success of that, this is, the interior is not marble, it's mostly wood and plaster painted to look like marble, but the clarity of the spaces, if you can imagine this painted polychrome, it would be very sort of a frustrating sort of space to be in. Then of course, the modern architect Mario Botta built this incredible large cross-section model of all these. Now the horizontal lines are actually large wooden plates that were cut on a laser. I think this is in a lake in Switzerland, but this is one of the first places you can actually see the cross section of the building at full scale. I just thought that was really exciting to actually see this in person. I know I've shown this before, but these are just really worth seeing again. You can see that the geometry is more complex than some of the earlier classical and Renaissance proportions. If you look at the plan, there probably is a large golden section subdivided by squares and spheres. This is just a wonderful space to be in. This is right around the corner from the Pantheon in Rome. But this is, of course, another one of Borromini's churches. He had a very warped imagination, and apparently in the writings he was completely crazy. But you can see the craziness coming into the work and just the details. So we see the spire is a very playful sort of language on the earlier domes we've seen in the Renaissance. There's a wonderful cross section with shadows on it. Yes, I mentioned the term poche. It's a French term. It actually means pocket. Looks like these buildings have been carved out of a solid block of stone or plaster. In doing this, the thick walls intensify the spatial definition and experience. I just have this, I'm very partial to classical architecture because, of course, the walls are so thick, they have a certain amount of intensity and dimension that I think a lot of modern architecture kind of loses. I like them both, but I mean, look at that plan. Okay, so here's a ceiling of St. Ivo. This is either wood or plaster painted. This is not marble, but gosh, I mean, look at that church interior. Oh my goodness. And the craft is absolutely, these Italians were just masters at craft because this, of course, this is after Michelangelo. So we've seen Michelangelo, of course, we've seen Bernini's craft in sculpture, but these are just remarkable pieces of sculpture and architecture. So I didn't mention this, but we're roughly looking at, I think, the 1600s, right before we get to neoclassical architecture. There's another magnificent facade. This is one of the main churches, San Ignasi in Piazza Navona. Actually, the church itself, everything but the dome was designed by Borromini. The dome and the drum, of course, was designed by Carlo Rinaldi. I do want to go back to St. Peter's if I can find this image. What's interesting is that, I don't have Baroque sculpture. I should have shown you Bernini's classical architecture. But what happened is Bernini was, of course, an architect and a sculptor. I have an image, but he designed these tall bell towers. And what happened was the bell towers started ruining the foundation. So Bernini was kind of ostracized from doing architecture for a while because of that reason, is that some of the bell towers started to crack the foundation because apparently he didn't really understand or go back and augment the foundation for the tall bell towers that used to be here. So then as a result, he was not allowed to practice architecture in Rome anymore. Of course, sculpture was so unbelievable that most people really associate Bernini, of course, with sculpture. Of course, he did do the curved exedra, from which I don't have an image of it. Well, I think this is all the slides and information I have. I've gone over a lot of information in 40 minutes. Do you guys have any questions, or do you want me to stop at some of the images? Next week, we'll be looking at Baroque sculpture and neoclassical architecture.
So there are no questions in the chat at this time.
Okay.
Oh, I do have something to say. I Googled you. This is really nerdy.
No.
It's posh. There's no accent on the E, so it's just posh. And I Googled it and double checked to make sure I was, but it's just, when you deal with lots of, yeah, talk to somebody speaks French and you can double check.
Really? So it's actually not poche, it's poche. Interesting.
Yeah, poche.
Well, that would make sense because a poached egg is not a poached egg. I guess. It's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
And then also, you were talking about the Renaissance painting, and yes, I completely understand there was no rendering of form of atmospheric perspective or linear perspective. But I've often thought that the medieval art, it was the art of the ruling classes and of the churches, and
Yes.
that's what has come down through history. And just like it was a fashion and a mode. And so I've often wondered that there were probably undercurrents of people who did the old traditional painting. I think of the Coptic funeral masks, were very rendered. And just like contemporary art, 20th century art, you have what's codified and honored at the Modern Art Museum. And yet there was a whole ecosystem of artists who painted realism, who did, and so it was there, and it just sort of ebbs and flows as who's the moneyed class that's going to support it.
Right.
So it's just, it's.
No, that is interesting, because I think in lecture, really to prove a point, I like to show drastic examples of, like this one without any sort of three-dimensional depth, and just to compare it. But yeah, of course, sure, there were people that could paint three-dimensionally. It just wasn't, I hate to say fashionable, it wasn't really widely accepted.
Yeah.
And then, they, of course, they did have atmospheric perception, but they certainly did not know linear perspective like this. But then, we're looking at really early 1400 AD. I think I mentioned this, Carolyn, but earlier in 79 AD, when they, I think the volcano of Pompeii is in the 1700s, when they removed all the volcanic ash, they knew that this first century AD artists already knew linear perspective, which I find fascinating. It's been covered up. That's really remarkable. So it really wasn't really Brunelleschi that created, he reinvented it, but he's not knowing that he knew about Pompeii. But it's
and I think what he presented was a teachable, had a system, and therefore more people were able to understand it and pick it up so quickly. Before it might have been like, oh, we understand this, but we don't know how to articulate it and share it broadly so that everybody can utilize it.
And then so any layperson, I wish I would have loved to have been Brunelleschi. He was a god. And also what's interesting is that, the stories around town, there's a wonderful book written by Ross King called Brunelleschi's Dome. I'm sure you probably heard of that, but parts of the information said a lot of the people in Florence thought he was a homeless person. They kept seeing him. He didn't shower well. Of course, they didn't really have a lot of showers, but he looked completely miserable and like a grunge person from the Arno River. And they said, who is that funky looking guy working on the dome? He goes, oh, that's the architect. Like, that's the architect that did that? Oh my gosh. It's just, when you read these backstories, and of course, Michelangelo was just a menace to even work with, but who cares? Their work was just extraordinary. And as any architect, I would love to show, I would encourage people to look at architectural models. Look at that model of the Pantheon. It's unbelievable. Yeah. Well, does anyone have I hate to, well, this is kind of a high school question, but does anyone have any favorite projects that they're really drawn to in this one? They're all amazing, but.
Well, one of the things that you brought up that I thought was really interesting is that the Renaissance buildings, um, with the advent of linear perspective that could be
Mhm.
taught, it was like, come into my building and you're going to see everything that, you know,
Oh, well, yeah, of course. Oh, yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
And then the Baroque is sort of like, oh, okay, been there, done that, and it's like,
Mhm.
well, now let me confuse you and let me, you
Oh,
know,
I know.
yeah.
These are just visibly perplexing. Because I can draw really well. I thought, oh my goodness, to draw this, and then you have to, convey it to the layperson to actually lay the plan out, and not really the plan, but how would the plaster person even do work like this? You can see you can see the ceilings on my screen, right?
Mhm.
Gosh, I mean, you would have to have these were all master craftsmen to do work like this. Yeah.
And then I was going to say, theologically, what was going on, because wasn't that about the time that Martin Luther did his thing, and then we have the
Mm.
Western Hemisphere. So I always see it as the Catholic Church coming back and saying, we have mysteries and,
Oh yeah.
a different type of definition of Christianity compared to the Christianity of Luther, where, oh, you can read the Bible too, and you can
Right.
figure it out for yourself. So there's this, and of course, the Italians, that's home of opera.
Oh no, well that's an excellent point because I mean, yeah, that I'm sure I'm kind of the hidden geometry is based on religious beliefs and certain symbology, of course. I mean, you wouldn't really see, well, let me see if I can find this one. Like, you wouldn't see a plan like this in ancient classical architecture. Now, this is before Christianity, and so they were, worshiping multiple gods. So that's an interesting relationship, yeah. Mhm. I've mentioned this several times before, but from 450 AD to 1800 AD, no concrete whatsoever, stone and masonry. You would think out of all that work, like especially um, Brunelleschi's dome, as imaginative and genius as he was, could we not figure out the ratio of the three different materials and make it work? But this is what they had to work with, so. So I guess I'm starting to teach a class tomorrow. I was going to ask, so Mr. Swift, what is the main difference between Gothic and Renaissance architecture? Could you identify that? Carolyn, could you do it? The main difference.
I was daydreaming. Say it again.
Oh, okay, well, so anyone in the class. So what is the main difference between Gothic and Renaissance architecture? The main difference.
Hmm. You had mentioned, and I completely agree, it's the shape of the arches. You have the sort of soaring vertical and the thinness, and all the glass and whatnot. And the Renaissance, is reviving the Roman, where you have a much heavier, more massive feeling to it. The arches and the curves and whatnot. And I missed last week's lecture, so I can't speak of it. But
Oh, we were in Romanesque. Yeah.
okay, Romanesque, yeah. And then the Gothic, which is a from the Middle Eastern, the Crusaders coming back and bringing this new style
Mhm.
that, because I've been in Gothic revival churches where they'll have the Gothic revival and then the chandeliers will be directly something from, you get a very Orientalism sense. Of course, Orientalism
Yeah.
was a really big thing, like in the 1850s, 1880s. And to
Mhm.
have those two things together. And
Yeah, well, I think, going back to the original question, you could probably say that, the main difference between Renaissance and Gothic architecture is Renaissance architecture does not have buttresses because the
oh
structure is
yeah,
totally
that's right.
steel. That was a main change. And it's interesting that as exciting, I think the Gothic architectures are more, cathedrals are more visibly exciting that just the fact that Renaissance architects would consider this visibly vulgar, but that's their, relationship back then. It's, let me see if I can find that. Yeah, I mean, this is truly a modern dome because we're not using the flying buttresses. And, they didn't build domes back in Gothic architecture. They built crossings with towers and spires. Well, anyone else have a question or a comment? Michelle, do you have any questions or she's our moderator this afternoon?
No, I don't have any questions, but earlier in the conversation or the lecture, I dropped in the chat that this stone, the gray stone that they use in Florence along with the marble, is actually a sandstone that comes from the region by Arezzo and Volterra, and it's called Pietra Serena, and they actually paved their streets with it as well. So when I was there a few years ago, it was really interesting to see these massive blocks that they were repaving the street with because it gets all uneven as it settles and stuff. So kind of interesting.
Well, that is a great piece of information because every time I look at these, the columns are so delicately thin. It must have been a very strong sandstone to do this.
It is extremely dense, and I'm actually familiar with this stone because there's a stone supplier here in Texas that sells it. They actually distribute it.
Holy. And Michelle, you're Italian, so you should know it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we do have about 10 more minutes. Any other questions or comments or?
Well, I will make a comment. I'm really chatty today. Just seeing this reminds me of a conversation I had decades ago where another Californian and I were, just discussing the decline of ecclesiastical architecture.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, most people who attend churches now do not have this sense of awe. So when you go to Europe and you just see these buildings that are just a part of people's spatial and historical awareness. And several years ago, I listened to David McCullough's book, The Greater Journey, and it's about Americans going to Paris and how those years, 1840s to 1900s, completely transformed American culture, because it talks about the Americans that went over. And the part I loved was, and these are all based on actual letters and journal entries. And so you have these Bostonians who considered themselves, the peak of American culture. They lived in the most sophisticated, educated city in the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
And so they go across the Atlantic, they land in Le Havre, they're going down the Seine, and they come to Rouen, and they experience the cathedral there, and they were just blown away because they had no idea.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, because we're lucky to have, because I'm in Dallas, I love to go to Mark Lemon's Gothic cathedrals he designed in Park Cities, and gosh, and then I go to some of the smaller, I go to some of the other churches that have these large auditoriums, and there's nothing spiritual about visiting an auditorium with someone with a microphone and
yes.
You can't get that experience at all.
Yeah. It's just a difficult, it's awkward.
It is, yeah. Okay, well. I would like you to remember these dates and, of course, these pivotal architects. I didn't include a lot of Michelangelo. We've already seen tons of Michelangelo's work and, of course, Palladio's work. Okay, well, I guess if there aren't any other questions, then I think, Michelle, we can probably end the lecture.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We meet again next week. So we'll see you guys then.
Okay.
All right,
I'll see you guys next week.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.